What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. NFL Draft Podcast had to take a little bit of a back seat last week due to free agency, which I thought was going to be like more lively, I guess, for us over here on this channel. But wasn't bad. We got the big news of the DK Metcalf trade before free agency began. But we're excited to get back after it today. Get back into talking some draft. We're talking quarterbacks, aka the most difficult position to evaluate, but everyone's favorite nonetheless. I'm excited to get all like my thoughts out there, especially with how many questions seem to be thrown my way on Twitter and everything. But it felt especially appropriate, I feel like, to pivot this direction just because, Pittsburgh doesn't really have like a starting caliber signal caller on the roster right now. So Mason Rudolph comes back, cheap fallback option on a backup type of deal. But it seems like there's a real chance that they could take a shot at somebody on draft weekend, even if it's not necessarily in the first round. So joining me today to dissect this, I would say, polarizing group of passers is the quarterback guru himself, Nick Martin. Nick, how we doing, brother?
Oh man, after having to dive into so much quarterback film, I almost feel nauseous from the amount of decisions being made and the fact that the Steelers could be having to pick from this crop of passers, considering
Yep.
like some of their flaws and some of the things that they do well. And I'm really eager to get my thoughts out on why I feel certain way about certain players.
Yeah. Yeah, I will say this, and I joke around a lot on like social media, and I've joked on this quarterback class as a whole a lot, really dating back since this time last year, because we got so spoiled last year with the quarterback class that we had coming out. It was a really, really special group. I felt like this year, obviously not on that caliber, not that tier, but I don't think that this class is that all that comparable to like 2022. And like that's something I think kind of is getting thrown out a lot just around like, Steelers Twitter and everything else. This is not that, in my opinion. I actually think that this class does have some talent. I think there's at least one player in this class that's definitely better than came out of that one. Of course, that class only produced one real starter, which is Brock Purdy. Like all the top guys that were taken, we didn't have a lot of top guys taken. Only one guy in the first round, and then several on day two. None of those guys really panned out to be starters, at least yet at this point in their career. But this class does have talent. I actually think there's maybe an abnormal amount of like backup options in this class, which
Yeah.
I guess I kind of I watched a little over 12 guys for this podcast, and we're going to talk, Nick and I, about our top fives, break those guys in down in depth, talk about the strengths, weaknesses, projections of these types of players. But actually, like as I got deeper into the class, like there's even some backup options that I think are going to have lengthy careers, just because I feel like they bring valuable skills to the table, even if they're not necessarily going to be starters long term, at least in my viewpoint. So I'm excited to jump into this. Just before we get started, if you guys could just hit that like button, make sure you're subscribed, turn on notifications, all that good stuff is very appreciated. I mentioned we're going to do top fives today, but I am actually going to drop my full quarterback rankings list over on SteelersNow.com. Sometime in the next 24 hours, I'll try to link that, go back and link that in the description. But if you follow me on social media, you'll see that when I tweet it out. But without further ado, man, you ready to get started?
Yes,
I
sir.
always forget who went first last time. Do you want me to go first and go with five, or you want to go?
Oh, you can go first. I'm curious
Okay.
to see your thoughts.
All right. So as always, Nick and I did not share our rankings. We didn't really talk a lot this weekend. We're kind of coming through the film, but we didn't share our rankings just to give you guys like an authentic experience when to keep it natural. But my number 5 quarterback in this class is Louisville passer Tyler Shough. So very interesting evaluation. We've talked about Shough quite a bit, you and I, and we've talked about him on the podcast. But a very interesting prospect because he's an older guy. Obviously, he's going to be a 26-year-old rookie. He had three consecutive season-ending injuries. Texas Tech, originally committed to Oregon. He was Justin Herbert's backup. Goes to Louisville this past season. Plays extremely well, honestly. From a film perspective, there's a lot to like about Shough's game, but just kind of starting with the build. I mean, 6'5", 220 pounds. So he's got the prototypical size that I feel like NFL teams historically value for the position. It's it's actually funny because he comes from an old like pro style offense under Brom, and that was something that I got a chance to talk to him a little bit about at the combine, was which was really cool because they said that seeing that he was an older guy and clearly a smart player, they gave him a lot of freedom at the line of scrimmage. So he got up there. They called in multiple plays, so similar to like stuff that an NFL team's going to ask him to do. He got up there at the line of scrimmage. He used the cadence. He got them into different plays based on the pre-snap tells of the defense. I thought that was pretty cool. He mentioned a couple big runs that he checked into that
Yeah, he
was,
called a hidden yardage, if I remember correctly.
and that's really good to see that like mental acumen for sure. And he's just got experience playing under center, which is also not really something we can say about all of these guys. So I just think the arm, it really pops on tape, man. Like he can throw the football away from defenders, leverage down the field. He has the velocity to where like he can hit these keyhole size windows. There's some anticipatory throws on tape, especially like I feel like those were more prevalent on outside the number plays on kind of like comebacks and out routes, but most of the time, like I felt like he was hitting guys in stride, getting the ball out before the break point. There's some middle of the field throws, like getting back to like the backside digs and stuff like that, but it is a tick slower than really where it needs to be.
Agreed.
But he is a true pocket passer. Like he wants to get the ball out quickly. He's got the 9.3 pressure to sack ratio. That's a really low number, especially in comparison to this class. That's a historically low number, I feel like, for a draft prospect. But also, like, he's not a statue. So, like, he can move around the pocket a little bit. Like, he had some really nice throws in the low red zone area, like the Notre Dame one that you and I both tweeted out. But there was also one against Kentucky, I felt like, where he was like rolling left. So he can play make a little bit, get out of the pocket. And I feel like he meets like the baseline requirements for like, can this dude scramble and get a first down when we need him to? But as far as the negatives to Shough's game, it's really interesting because I felt like all of his negatives are really related around like his response to pressure. And it's kind of unfortunate because I want to like him more than I do, because he has this really like nasty habit. He throws off his back foot and falls off his platform consistently. Like
Yeah.
when pressure isn't necessarily in his face, he just does it almost out of habit. Doesn't step up and like hitch up and climb in the pocket, especially when things get muddy. I thought that his decision making took a notable step backwards. If you look at like the turnover worthy plays, when he was kept clean last year, like the stat sheet was completely clean. I think he only had one turnover worthy play. When he was under pressure, I think that number jumped to like 7. So all of his game kind of like fell apart a little bit when there was pressure in the pocket, which is just notable because that's a big part of playing quarterback in the NFL, right? Like those guys are under pressure like 35% of the time. So that was the real big weakness for me. Obviously, the injuries and things like that are going to be notable, but just the processing is still a little bit slow for me. And then also just the response to pressure. I'm just really nervous about how he's going to take to the NFL and if he's going to be, that guy that's going to be able to stand in there with live bullets flying around him and make plays. I don't know if you have Shough in your top 5, but what'd you think of his game?
I actually have him at number 4, so I can add a little bit on this.
Yeah,
The thing with Tyler Shough that like stands out to me, obviously, you mentioned his arm talent, his ability to manipulate his
could
arm
spin it
angles. It's absolutely like one of the best parts about his game. If you go and watch the Georgia Tech game, you'll see a throw where like he scrambles left outside the pocket. He has his tight end and the corner's got like outside leverage, and then there's a safety inside, and he ends up putting it on the inside shoulder perfectly away from both defenders. And I was just like, all right, then this is a quarterback who has clear talent that like is being overlooked at the time. A lot of that has changed a bit though with his
for
rise
sure.
in Senior Bowl, his his willingness to compete at the combine. I think he won a lot of people over, just like really getting into like the 40-yard dash, getting the crowd into it. I think there was a lot of people who wanted to see him succeed, and I think knowing his background and his injuries, it is a very important thing. But also, you mentioned the processing speed on backside plays. I do think in terms of the if we're accounting for his age, I don't think it's to the point where you necessarily like where his
Hmm.
processing is at for his age. But the thing I do think is really strong about his game is I see him get the ball out, no hitch, better than any quarterback in this class. It doesn't matter if it's a vertical shot, doesn't matter if he's throwing it hot. I consistently just see him hit the back foot and get hit both cleats in the ground, ball out. And even though sometimes I do agree with this, he has a bad pop. Like I think John Ledyard said it actually. He was talking about posture stances against pressure and stuff like that. And the
Hmm.
thing you notice with Tyler Shough, he's consistently like falling away from that pressure. But the weird thing about watching him is I always felt like in terms of how he would navigate like exterior pressure versus like interior pressure, he knew how to climb pretty well and he had a pretty good like sense of when to like go into fight or flight in terms of like going flight, which I like to call it like going outside the pocket,
Yeah.
making those plays outside. I think he had a good sense of balancing that, but like you said, it's his posture, it's how he responds to that in terms of while the process is good, the result ends up being a lot worse because of the you talk about it, the turnover worthy plays, and in some instances they happen on throwaways. Like he's one of the better quarterbacks in terms of throwing away the ball, but he has a big problem when it comes to throwing it away and just not realizing, oh, this defender literally is going to have an opportunity to make a play on the
Yeah.
ball. And I think that's something he needs to clean up. I think that's something that really caps his ceiling right now. I've had concerns about, quarterbacks like that before.
Hmm.
We talk about Derek Carr as like one of those quarterbacks who has a really good arm, but he has really bad like responses to pressure. I think you could see kind of a similar if you're looking for a similar case study, I would say Derek Carr is a very similar case study in the high end degree of he's become a starting quarterback. He's gotten paid. He is able to do enough to be, a starting quarterback, be like a top 15, top 20 guy in the league. And I think Tyler Shough has a lot of those similar type of traits, but he has the age working against him. The processing speed isn't quite where you want it, but there is flashes of enough that you can say, okay, maybe. But
Yeah.
again, it's draft capital. You
Yeah.
don't want to be drafting this guy in the second round. You don't want to be drafting him in the first round. You want to draft him at a price you feel comfortable with. And I think like around the third round is where I feel comfortable with Tyler Shough as at this moment.
Yeah, I mean, we view him very similarly, and just in terms of like grades and like where we feel like he should be considered to come off the board. The one thing about the throwaways too, just like, I mean, it's difficult to describe without showing the plays, but there are literal plays on his film where he is kind of spinning almost in the grass of defenders, and he's throwing at a running back in the flat, and
Yeah.
it's not a calculated throw where it's like, hey, I'm going to throw it at this guy's feet. Like there are just some throws that like, hey man, like we would rather you just eat the sack. Like it's not worth it. And I think that there are times where I felt like he was rushing through his decisions a little bit, because there are Sunday throws like on his tape. Like you can go look any game up, and you see like the stuff that you want to see, like what NFL like concepts that NFL offenses are running. And like again, like that's not the case with all of these guys. So I think the highs are really special, and you combine that with the traits, the size, the arm talent, you get really excited about it. It's just for me, I know that wherever he goes, like he's gonna be under pressure like 35% of the time. And I just felt like almost all of his bad reps came when that stuff happened. And I'm just really worried about how that's gonna be at the next level. He also the a couple things I noted: setting really deep in the pocket. That was something that I thought was a little bit of an issue. Not as bad as some of the other guys we're going to talk about in this episode, but there was some of that. He doesn't, I think he's a solid athlete, but he doesn't have like that quick twitch movement that I necessarily always look for either. He's more smooth rather than like twitchy.
He's
So like
very
when you,
efficient. He's got a very efficient drop back. Like
yeah,
everything from the lower to the upper half is really clean. Like the throw, like the release, the throwing motion into like the footwork. Like that's the aspect I really feel like
yeah.
is like great about Tyler Shough, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think like some of that I would have just liked to have seen him more, especially like as he's getting deeper in the pocket, just be more willing to like step up because I do think some of the really intriguing stuff was like the stuff that he was doing under center, turning his back to the defense, like where you want to take some shot plays down the field, especially with his arm, because like he can spin it, like he can throw it really far. He's got I feel like pretty good touch and understanding of where the ball needs to go on those deep shots. But it's like if we're going to do that, he's going to be required to kind of step up into the pocket. And, you know, NFL pockets are a lot different than college pockets. That's one of the reasons why this position is so difficult to navigate. So, but I know that's a lot on Tyler Shough, but let's go to your next one. You said Shough was at 4 for you. So who's your number 5 guy?
My number 5 is Jaxson Dart, and this is going to be a bit of a complicated talk through. But in
Oh
terms of
yeah.
the things I like about Jaxson Dart, so one of the things that really grew on me is actually his ability in the quick game in the intermediate areas towards like the boundary, like the outside the numbers stuff. He has really good anticipation. Like it doesn't matter like if his footwork is kind of slow, he knows like when to throw guys open like before the break happens. When he has like a decent enough favorable leverage, which he does a lot of times in this Ole Miss offense, he can really be confident just slinging in there. And I think he does a good job at that. I also really think his arm talent gets undersold a lot. I think he has good ability off platform to make some like big time throws like on the move. He can throw with velocity. He's got a very notable like he's a very twitchy lower half athlete in terms of being able to fire his back hip through every throw. It's always consistent with it, like his weight transfer, and it's something I noticed about him. And I think his arm isn't necessarily like amazing, but his ability to generate torque from the lower half really compensates for that, allows him to throw, you know, with a lot more velocity than a lot of some of these other guys. The things I don't like about Jaxson Dart, when he has complicated post snap reads, like post snap like looks that just don't match what he saw pre snap, he folds. He folds in the sense that he tries to guess where he'll stay with his immediate pre-snap assumption, and he ends up getting burned for it. A lot of times, especially in the Florida game, he was just losing his mind in the last 2 minutes of that game. He wanted to throw an interception like at least 2 different times, and it was really frustrating watching that experience. But also the LSU game, he had really bad responses in terms of just like there are throws that like ended in better results than it did from the process perspective. And we talk about pressure. While his numbers under pressure might seem like okay from this point of view, I don't like the process of how he responds to it. He tends to drop his posture a lot and he drops his eyes with it, so he ends up looking towards the rush a lot of the time. Just because of that, he ends up missing a lot of open guys that he should be throwing it at that point. He shouldn't be having his eyes towards the rush. He shouldn't be thinking about that. And that's kind of my issue with Dart is he if he doesn't see it, he is going to run. And a lot of that offense is built around his legs. That
Hmm.
offense also doesn't allow him to do a lot of pre-snap um stuff at the line of scrimmage, like, protections, audibles, all of those things in terms of the things that he needs to look for, things he needs to do at the next level. There, it's jump to the NFL. As we've seen with Jalen Hurts, like he didn't do protection calls until like this last season
Right.
in the league, which is crazy to think about. But like these quarterbacks, they have a lot on their plate and they have a lot to process. And the fact that Dart is kind of just really far behind from that perspective, it really makes me scared about his potential prospects in terms of reaching that upside. I think there is a very specific like scenario he needs to go to where he is not being asked to start right away. He needs to sit at least a couple years, not 1 year, a couple.
Yeah.
He needs to be able to see how NFL, quarterbacks like prepare at the line of scrimmage, how they adapt post snap. And I think Dart will it, a lot of it can come together for him if he's able
Yeah.
to do that. But again, specific scenario, he needs to go to the right place, and I'm not so sure that there's a lot of good infrastructures around the league to support that type of development plan. And certainly not the Steelers right now, as far as I'm concerned, with Mason Rudolph under center. I just don't think that Jaxson Dart makes a lot of sense for them early at this point.
Yeah, it would be one of those things where, like you mentioned, I think the Hertz thing is interesting because I hadn't really thought of that as a comparison. Not saying you're using that, but like there are
Yeah.
other people that I feel like have used the Jalen Hurts thing, at least that I've seen on my timeline. But I think we view him a little bit differently, I would say. But I mean, there are definitely some similarities between like kind of like our reports on him. First things first, I think when you look at Dart and like you just watch him play, he has like a really charismatic, I don't want to say aura because that's like makes me sound like a 18-year-old, but like he does have that like he plays with a chip on his shoulder, and I do think that that is a something that you kind of want from that position. That some of the things that I noted with him is he's tough as nails. He will stand in the pocket. He will try to. I mean, he takes some absolutely wicked shots. Now, sometimes I think he takes those shots because he doesn't get the ball out on time, and he waits till which we're about to talk about a little bit more. He waits until like he is 1,000% sure a guy's open to try to deliver the ball. But he takes shots, he gets right back up. You mentioned like how he factors into the run game. I mean, when they got into the red zone, they did some like really cool stuff with him using his legs, some like quarterback lead draw. Like you'll see do some things with some pullers and things like that. So I mean, he has some rushing ability, the ability as a scrambler. He hit Arkansas with a like I want to say like a 40-yard run, like on a third down. One thing I did note about his response to pressure is he drops his eyes consistently, and it's really difficult to play like that in the NFL. That was something that I noted, not to compare the two players, but like that was a big thing for me with Pickett, like when he was coming out. Now their responses are a little bit different. Dart isn't as bad about like bailing out the back door and like floating to his right like Pickett was, but it's one of those things where like if he does see pressure flash and he's not like locked into a receiver at that point in time, he drops his eyes. And sometimes when he gets out of the pocket, he will get them back up, which I think that is a good thing. It does help him play make a little bit. He does have some special throws, I felt like, outside the pocket. He has a flexible arm to make off platform throws. I see a solid athlete for NFL standards. I'm just not sure if he's going to be able to live this way in the league because of how fast edge rushers are. It's just a little bit, actually, it's a lot different than the guys that he was seeing in college. But from an arm standpoint, I don't think that he has a ton of juice when he tries to drive the football. There were some throws that I felt like some outbreakers and things like that that got left inside. Some of that could be placement, but I felt like I saw it enough to where I noted that he was having some difficulty driving the ball outside of the numbers. What I think he does best as a passer, you mentioned the stuff in the intermediate area of the field. The touch is really good. Like he
Yes.
really has a good way of like I was impressed by some of the layered shots like up the seams, over linebackers, things like that. He knew like when the appropriate time was to kind of take some juice off and when to try to fire it up. The issue with Dart really comes down beyond the pressure thing, which is something we're going to talk about really with pretty much all of these guys. I feel like is just the processing speed. I mean, it's so slow. You talked about just like understanding when the picture changes post snap, how that needs to accelerate what he's doing from a mental standpoint. He just doesn't have it. Like it is very like he is very much to me a see it, throw it type of passer right now. And I didn't see a ton of anticipation on his tape. When I did see it, it was outside of the numbers. I felt like he was better in that area if it was like his first read and he could get the ball out. Like you mentioned, I felt like his setup, footwork, lower body, weight transfer was all pretty good, especially in comparison to the rest of the guys in this class. And I don't think there's a ton to work that needs work from that regard. The release is pretty good. I do think that the touch throws really in the intermediate area of the field were nice. The NFL stuff that I felt like he was asked to do, there were some like 3-level stretch concepts, like half field reads of him doing like they run a ton of sail.
Yeah, I was
So,
gonna say I was
oh
actually
my
gonna bring
God.
that up. That is his favorite throw, man. He
Yeah.
will throw that with anticipation every single time,
Yeah.
and sometimes he'll get bitten in the butt for it because if you look at the Florida game, they sailed they absolutely baited him into that one.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes loses track of some of the curl flat defenders for sure. But yeah, that I mean that was just a concept that they ran like over and over. So I do think that Dart offers like starter level traits. I think that the big reason that he's my number 4 guy. Probably should have mentioned that from the jump, but I think the big difference between like how I view him as like kind of a day 2 developmental type of player. I think I have Dart with like around like a early 3rd round grade. And that's honestly come up because I feel like honestly I've watched more of him than I have of anybody else in the class, just because he's probably the guy that I've been asked most about. But like the reason why I think I view him a little bit differently is because all of these guys on this list, especially like my top 3 guys, are more like developmental type of prospects, guys that aren't necessarily ready to play right away, but I would be interested in working with. It's just with Dart, I think he falls in that category more than he does like a true guy that needs to be taken in the first round, because I do think he's a year away from playing at the very least. And I think the transition from that Ole Miss offense that didn't ask a lot of him going into the pros is going to be a bumpy one. And I think I'm just a
Yeah.
little bit more lukewarm on the ceiling of him as a player, mainly because I don't see like an arm that really jumps off the film, I guess, beyond from a talent perspective. Like I think his arm is above average for NFL standards. If you categorize everything like touch, release, like the off platform stuff. But I just think the velocity that I just don't think he drives the ball that well. So that was kind of my thoughts on Dart.
That's fair. In terms of velocity, I'm a little bit in a different page just because I think he does show the ability to drive it. I just don't I think he tries to feather it in too often. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of his misses at the 3rd level just stem from how late he ends up being to
Yeah.
to throw the ball, and that's why he ends up having so many underthrows.
Yeah,
But
and that's sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that's another thing. Like with the like, if you look at like the deep ball numbers, like one thing I like about his game is that he will push the ball down the field.
yeah.
But he's in an offense that is literally designed to give him a bunch of one-on-one opportunities down the field. Like they run a lot of like switch verts and things like that, getting their receivers, some of which can really run, matched up on safeties and take those shots down the field. So there's just like you watch the offense, and as much as you admire it, as good as Kiffin is at his job on Saturdays, it's just not really stuff that you see a lot in the league, and that's what's going to make for a really interesting kind of transition for Dart. But I do like the player. I was really trying hard to like him more than I did, and I just couldn't quite get there.
I was in
Um,
that same boat.
yeah. Who is your? So I had Dart at 4. Who's your number 3 guy?
My number 3 guy is Jalen Milroe out of
Let's
Alabama.
go.
Yep. So Milroe is a very interesting case because I think he had. So if you look at his pressure to sack numbers, they are extremely concerning. But when it comes to his responses to pressure, I thought in terms of how he would, for his first reaction to pressure, I thought he showed really good ability to be able to just climb the pocket, and I thought he stood strong in some aspects of like pressure. Like sometimes he'd face pressure from both his like left tackle and his right tackle and the center, and he would still stand in there and make the throw. Like he shows a lot of fearlessness in a lot of that regard to make that throw. And I really like seeing that in a quarterback. I like seeing that fearlessness. Now, there it sometimes becomes oblivious at there's aspects where it can become a bit oblivious and he ends up taking like a bad sack from his blind side. Fumbles are a huge problem with him. Like he has smaller
Small
hands and
hands.
yeah, they grew though during the combine.
Ain't it crazy?
But fumbles have been a huge problem for him. He has issues with not only ball carriage, but also just like not feeling that backside pull. And a lot of times he ends up losing the ball just in situations where he just shouldn't. But in terms of what I was impressed with him as a thrower, this is actually more just from a field general quarterback perspective. I think he sees the field a little bit as he's a bit underrated in terms of his field vision. I think he shows really good responses in terms of reading coverage leverage. Like there's an instance against Auburn. We both clipped this throw, but he has he has two posts and he has the middle safety in between. So he pumps on the on the inside most post to get that safety to bite in, and then he throws it right over his head and puts it perfectly on his receiver, but it was dropped. And drops were a problem for Alabama. Like they were
Oh
among
yeah,
the teams that had the most drops in the country. And like even their star freshman Ryan Williams wasn't like, he wasn't like he definitely had issues in that regard. But in terms of like some of the lows, like with Milroe, a lot of it just stems from there are accuracy misses on some like egregiously wide open receivers, like against
yeah.
Tennessee, Missouri. You'll see a guy just sitting with nobody even close, and he'll just flat out miss it. It doesn't happen too often in the short, quick game, which makes me think that the accuracy can be fixed in that area because a lot of it happens in the intermediate side, and a lot of times I see him be really precise in that intermediate area. Like if you see on like some deep over routes or some sail routes, like he puts the ball in a really good spot. I also really like think he throws with some underrated anticipation flashes. Now I say flashes because they come and go a lot of the time. I don't think he's
Hmm.
an anticipatory passer, but I think he has the makings of being one. Like for instance, the Georgia game was one of the best games you'll watch for a quarterback in this draft class. But you watch
For
him
sure.
backed up in his own end zone. He gets faced with a huge blitz look. Guy running right in his face in the interior pressure. He has a Hank concept. He ends up throwing his guy open well before the break even happens, puts it right on him. It makes an underrated adjustment to the ball, but I was still impressed to like seeing him get the ball out hot in that type of situation. Because if you think about what Jalen Milroe has been billed as, a lot of people think he doesn't really have good responses to pressure. I I tend to not believe that because there's a lot of instances on film where he shows that understanding of, yeah, I need to get the ball out hot here. Yeah, I need to get outside the pocket or I need to climb. And a lot of times when he climbs, he has a really good de-acceleration. Like he stops himself pretty well. He just needs to do a better job of like setting himself when he gets outside the pocket because
Yeah.
that's where some misses can tend to happen a little bit off platform. In terms of the deep ball, gorgeous deep ball thrower.
Oh
One
yeah.
of the he can absolutely shred it on some hole shots, some post routes, seam shots. He shows a particularly good touch, like a game against Vanderbilt, Missouri. He was able to thread some in there in some looks where he has underneath coverage and he still feathers it over. I think that was what was impressive about Milroe is he has a better control over his throws than I thought he would. And I really thought he would be more of this like one speed pitcher. And I think he's really kind of developed like another speed to his pitch. And I liked seeing that a lot with him. As for, like where would I take Jalen Milroe? I feel really confident about him in the second round. Second round, third round, day two area is where I'm really comfortable taking him. I think he is a guy that if you're looking for the highest upside in this quarterback class and you really want to go in on the highs of someone, Milroe is that type of guy. You have absolutely game-breaking athleticism in the quarterback ground game. I mean, we don't even need to talk about some of these runs where he's just outrunning some outrageous pursuit angles like against LSU Missouri. There was the run against Georgia along the sideline. Like his his ability to just run laterally is absolutely insane. It's something I haven't seen quite since Lamar in that regard, and I think they are similar as runners, but not quite to the level as you know those
Passers.
yes, as passers, but also like as field generals, like because Lamar, he did a lot of his own protection calls, his audibles at the line of scrimmage. He was very ready in that regard. He played at Louisville under that pro style system. Milroe had a little bit more hand holding at the line of scrimmage, and he had to, sometimes he would do it himself, and sometimes like the coaches had to audible for him, based off the looks that he was given. So I like seeing Milroe's flashes, and I think the fact he has those flashes makes me want to bet on him the most out of the day two quarterbacks. It's considering he's getting under like overlooked in this class. I really do
Hmm.
believe that like he's that guy that you want to take a shot on day two.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, he's number 3 on my board too. I mean, I don't feel as if just like the way that the conversation around the draft is kind of unfolded just over the past, really since September or whatever. I feel like he is kind of going overlooked. A lot of people are just completely out, and I do get it to some degree. But I feel like his evaluation is pretty straightforward, man. Like you watch the kid play. Um, he's a complete freak show. I mean, this dude, I'm not even being hyperbolic when I say this. I think he's one of the most gifted, maybe the most gifted, like athletic quarterback that we've maybe ever seen. Like you mentioned the Lamar comparisons as a runner. The straight line speed, the acceleration, the ability to like destroy. I mean, there's never been a pursuit angle that he couldn't beat. Like, I mean, it is unbelievable the way that he can just run around guys and then turn up field. You mentioned the lateral agility. I think he's got pretty solid vision. I think Lamar's vision and feel for space and defenders was better. And I think he's a little bit more, I felt like jump cutty, like elusive, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Whereas Jalen, there's like legit power to the way that he runs the ball, and I think that that's why like he drew some of the Hurts comparisons early on, just because a lot of his strengths are what Jalen's strengths were. I just feel like they're more exaggerated, and like the big difference was Jalen really took a huge step forward at Oklahoma. I felt like just in terms of being able to win from the pocket. We never did quite see that consistency from Milroe, but he's like Hurts in the regard that like he's a powerful, powerful runner. I mean, he just runs through cats. There was a game that I was watching yesterday where he broke contain of the pocket, and then there's this like the receiver on the left side of the screen. He's like trying to get out there and block for him, and this poor cornerback, like he's like bracing himself with the quarterback running his way, and it's just like that's just how powerful, how much fear you have of him coming your direction. But you mentioned the arm. I mean, strongest arm in the class, in my opinion. Like the ability to like take the top off of the coverage. Like we you just talked about the deep post example we both tweeted out yesterday or whatever. I mean, just unbelievably awesome deep ball, like a really gifted deep ball thrower. The sideline shots, I still remember like how good him and Jermaine Burton were last year on those plays. I do think that I wish as a scrambler he was more effective. Like once he got outside the pocket, like keeping his eyes up and being able to throw on the move. I just don't see that type of consistency. Same way within the pocket. There are just a lot of like accuracy misses. The thing that I will say that I feel like some people are forgetting because I guess it happened a long time ago. Milroe over the first half of the season did take a significant step forward,
Yeah,
in my opinion. You
exactly.
mentioned the sacks. The sacks were a massive issue in 2023. He had a 31% pressure to sack ratio. Totally. I mean, you can't play. You can't play like that in the NFL. He cut that number to 18% last year, and 18% is manageable. Like you can work around that 100%. So I felt like in general, like he had a better understanding of how to maneuver and manage muddy pockets, get the ball out more consistently on time. I felt like last year there were certainly times where he was trying a little bit too hard to be a little bit more robotical in the pocket. And I felt like
Yeah.
sometimes that was to his detriment, where it's like, okay, I know that I need to improve in here instead of like relying on his athletic gifts. that didn't necessarily always work for him. But there is like a 3-game stretch or so at the beginning of the season. You mentioned Vandy. I thought that tape was really good. I think Wisconsin was another one. There was a stretch early in the season where I did see like really nice things from him as a passer, showing more touch, getting over the middle of the field. Like he throws some like backside digs that I feel
I
like he
was
doesn't get
surprised
credit
about
for.
that. I really
Yeah,
was surprised about that.
and it's funny because like I feel like he gets there as much, if not more, than some of these other guys that are getting talked about. The issue with Jalen, in my opinion, is just the highs are exhilarating, but the lows are like unplayable, to be honest with you. Like to the point where like every time he drops back, you have a little bit of pause in your throat. And I think that's the big thing for me is I'm not sure. I'm not sure how well he bounces back from mistakes. I feel like his game can kind of just fall off a cliff at any moment. And not that I don't know if it's a confidence thing or anything like that, but you watch like the Tennessee game. I mean, it's as bad as like you'll see really in this class. I mean, things just really spiral. I mean, there's like a 3-4 play stretch in that game alone where he's just missing wide open receivers.
Michigan
But
game too.
yeah, but for me, it is like pretty straightforward. I mean, you have a super high ceiling because he's, this unprecedented basically athlete with a really great arm. He's got the dual threat ability. It's just, and I do think like he's a little bit smarter, or maybe more well developed above the neck than a lot of other people are giving him credit for. I think for me, I think the reason why I'm comfortable betting on Milroe, and this is the unfortunate part of the process that matters a lot that people like you and I aren't really privy to, like we don't get this information, as like what they are like as like people. That's huge, and everything that I've read, like character is like just off the charts, A++ type stuff, and notable hard worker. A guy that was really respected in the locker room. When he was benched 2 years ago, when Saban was there, the locker room like almost revolted. Like that's how strongly those guys in the room like feel about him. There's several quotes I've seen from like former teammates Terrion Arnold, Tyler Booker, Jermaine Burton, talking about like he would get up there and give like motivational speeches. I mean, he's just an easy guy. I feel like, and you listen to him talk like in interviews and things like that, you can just tell he's going to win over people like that. It's just a matter of like developing that consistency, especially from an accuracy standpoint. So I mean, at the end of the day, huge arm, insane athlete, good work ethic, character marks. Like that's a player that if you're looking for a dart throw, I mean that's a profile that is worth betting on, in my opinion. So we see him very similarly.
Yeah, especially if the Steelers do end up signing Aaron Rodgers and that ends up being the direction they end up going. Milroe makes a lot of sense as that type of dart throw that they can develop behind him. And, I think they're going to be taking a lot of different shots at quarterbacks over the coming years. It doesn't mean that they're going to hit one in this class, but if you're going to
Sure.
take one big dart throw, Milroe's the one I would do.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. I know we're kind of going a little bit long here, but we still got two guys we want to get to. I'm assuming that we have the same two players. So my number two guy is Shedeur Sanders, quarterback from Colorado. Really interesting player and evaluation, because I think that I think a lot of people may listen to this podcast and say like, okay, like why is he falling down boards? I actually like my stance on Shedeur hasn't really changed. I feel like we've just got more information. Like once we got to the combine, that maybe the league wasn't as high as like the media was, but this is always kind of the range of player that I've kind of seen on film, which is a potential starter at the next level, but not necessarily a guy who is a true like round one quarterback prospect. And that's okay to kind of talk about because he does have some strengths to his game. Starting with the strengths, this dude's played a lot of ball. So I think that's kind of worth noting because we saw some of these older, more experienced guys, Bo Nix, Jaden Daniels. Not saying he's going to have that type of rookie season, but we saw those guys, come in and have a lot of success early on in their careers just because they've kind of been through it. But I mean, he's got over 2,000 dropbacks in his career. So I think that was notable. He's also a guy that's helped, turn some programs around. I mean, Jackson State, they were, a lot better than people expected. Then he goes to Colorado, like, first season kind of bumpy. This past year, I'm just here to tell you, they won more games than they should. That defense is absolutely atrocious, aside from Travis Hunter. And the offensive ecosystem is something I think is worth discussing. But in terms of his evaluation, like the strengths, I mean, really, really good decision maker. Rarely puts the ball in harm's way. He takes care of the football. I think he's another guy that's absolutely tough as nails. To take the type of beating that he took in college is miraculous. And I'm pretty sure, like in the spring, he weighed in sub 200 pounds. The fact that his body was able to hold up over the course of the season, taking that many hits, was honestly astounding. Now, to be fair, Shedeur does create a lot of his own pressure because he sets too deep in the pocket and he's like a habitual drifter. He just kind of drifts and drifts and drifts. But it's worth noting that their offensive line, terrible. It was marginally better this year than it was in 2023, but their tackles just can't pass protect, man. And the fact that they were putting him in so many passing situations, it's a lot of bubble screens and like short, quick passes. But even then, like anytime they had to get in drop back situations, I mean, they were just blowing protections, blowing assignments left and right. He was kind of bailing them out. I think that the offensive ecosystem as a whole, aside from just having Travis Hunter, who is a fantastic receiver, in addition to his play at cornerback, was really, really bad. I think the design of the offense sucks. I think the offensive line was pretty poor. So the difficult part of his evaluation is I don't think that we ever really got to see Shedeur Sanders play the game that he's designed to play. And what I mean by that is like I think he's just this like point guard style player that can win from the pocket because he's got fantastic accuracy. Like first and second level accuracy, phenomenal. I mean, the dude just doesn't miss. Like when his base is right and he can actually step into the throw, everything's in rhythm. Like you talk about these in breakers and things like that. He hits the receivers in the hands, doesn't have to break stride. He'll throw it away from leverage. He understands how to throw with touch. I also think like you talk about a guy that can decipher like post snap rotations. Shedeur can do that. Like that's something that he is very capable of doing, in my opinion. I already mentioned like the ability to take care of the football. The downsides with Shedeur, honestly, it just comes down to I just don't think the tools are all that great, man. And like that is really unfortunate, and it's freaking crazy to say about Deion Sanders' son. But he's just a below average athlete. Like he tries to scramble, and he had to do so more in that system than I hope that he has to do in the NFL. But he does get ran down from behind. That's where a lot of the sacks take place as well. He's not as like quick and twitchy as you would kind of expect a player like him to be. He does some good things outside of the pocket. I just don't see him living like that in the NFL. And then in terms of his arm, the touch, the accuracy, all there. Just can't drive the football, man. Like, I mean, it is slightly below average at best, I would say, in terms of like the ability to drive the ball into tight windows. And I really am concerned about how that's going to look at the next level when things get even tighter, more condensed. There's less space. Receivers are getting less separation. But I do think, like, in terms of like having to go in and like run an NFL system, like I think that Shedeur can definitely do that above the neck. And I think that it's really unfortunate because I do think that he could have been, not to say like he would have graded like this for me personally, but and maybe he still goes top 5. Who knows, right? But I do think that he would have been in contention to be the first quarterback off the board if he were allowed to play the game the way that he really needs to play the game, which is more of like in my opinion, under center, shotgun, utilize play action, but get the ball out quickly in the first 2 levels. I think if he was allowed to play like that and able to play like that, we'd have seen a better product.
No, I can completely agree with you on that. And you talk about the offensive infrastructure and its design.
So
There
terrible,
are
man.
I lost my mind watching the Utah game. I don't know what they were doing with some of these, like the spacing, the the mirrored concepts. It was just all over the place. I'm like, how's Shedeur supposed to navigate this? Like, what's like he's got to scramble, go outside the pocket,
Yeah.
and just hope that someone comes open at that
And
point.
there are so many, like, I didn't mean to cut you off, but there are
Okay,
so many plays that I think there are just immediate pressure. Like there's so many quick wins up front. And yes, I do like he does hold on to the ball so long, But I also think like I just think that he had to be flexible and adjust to the way that he was playing because the offensive line was just untenable. And that's the part of the evaluation that I think really sucks is because I think if he were put in a better situation up front in a more, I don't know, like 2020 version of a actual offense, I think that we would have seen the player that I think he could eventually become at the next level. It's just to me the big drawback is, the tools aspect of it.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people tend to focus on his character or whatnot, or how he like interviews and like how he comes off. I don't really find that to be any part of the evaluation with him. I think he's just one of those athletes who's really confident in himself and he's not for everyone. He's not going to win every single, owner and front office guy over in those meetings, but I don't necessarily think Shedeur is like a bad apple by any means. I think he's a good
No.
character guy. I think he works extremely hard. You could see a lot of it, in his work ethic and a lot of like the results that he's been able to put up. I mean, you have to have that as Deion Sanders' kid for sure. Like he's
Yep.
definitely taught him about that work ethic. But you mentioned the the sacks. One of the things I found extremely interesting about him was how, like, again, you mentioned how deep his sets, his like, his dropbacks are. It's how slow sometimes his dropbacks are.
Oh yeah.
His feet don't tend to move as fast as I would like them to move in that situation. And I just don't think he has enough urgency, in his drop. So he ends up drifting like to the left and to the right, and it ends up putting him into bad pressure situations. And we've talked about, drifting in the past with guys like Kenny Pickett. One of the things I like about Shedeur that I didn't see with Kenny Pickett, he understands not to telegraph where you're going. He will sell the first move, and it allows him to, be able to spin out of some of these sacks. But you mentioned the athleticism. It's not something he's going to be able to get away with constantly at the NFL level. So you have to kind of just pick and choose a lot of, how can he do that in certain situations? Like he's not going to be able to do that as consistently. You mentioned
Mhm.
the spacing. There's so many like there's consistently with this offense, there's so much space that he's throwing to. There's a lot of like there's not a ton of like underneath leverage a lot of times that he's having to throw over, unless he's throwing it to the middle of the field, where I think he actually shines is where he's able
Oh
to
yeah.
just hit those seam shots, those digs. Those are like shots that he's really good at. And I think that those throws are really nice in his arsenal. He can layer it into those windows, throws it in stride. You mentioned the accuracy at the first and second level. It's about
It's
as good as
surgical is what it is.
it's
Yeah.
absolutely. And you talk about the third level accuracy though. The problem with the third level accuracy, and this is what I just kind of find interesting about him as a prospect. I've never really been a fan of stiff lower mechanical throwers where
Mhm.
their back hip fails to like really generate that torque consistently. And I noticed with Shedeur, his throws just lack torque. It doesn't always mean that like his arm is necessarily bad, but his arm looks much worse than it should because his lower half is not doing him a ton of favors, and it's why you see the ball end up inside on a lot of these like deep breaking, vertical shots. Like you see it with Travis Hunter, like he'll be like lined up to the field side and he's thrown to that side, and the ball's left way too far inside, and
He'd
still
still make
Travis,
the catch though.
yeah, he'll still make the catch. And that's kind of like where we talk
Yeah.
about the ball placement. It's not as translatable.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of what Shedeur is doing in that offense, you mentioned it. I think you knocked it out of the park. That's not what I want him to be doing in the NFL. I want him under
No.
center. I want him doing those fives, those 5 3-step drops.
And here's the thing too with Shedeur is like, you know, the reason why this is so difficult isn't just because like you're trying to evaluate the player, the traits, things like that, but you're also trying to see how all this stuff is going to translate to an NFL system. And I don't think he's going to be for everybody. I already mentioned like some of the velocity stuff, like you mentioned, like the underthrows on the deep shots, like it's all the time. Like it doesn't matter like which side, field side, boundary side. Like there's just so many underthrows on tape. The other thing is like when he's trying to throw like deep out routes and things like that from the far hash, like the ball just consistently gets left inside or it ends up dying on him. Now, the thing is with Shedeur is I really do think that some of the other things that I would classify as like, man, I don't love that. Like he will skip over reads from time to time, like when he's
Yeah.
in back there in the pocket, instead of going, 1 to 2 when he actually had like non-mirrored concepts called for him, which wasn't all the time. But instead of going like 1 to 2 to check down, it was just one check down. And then like there was times where I'm like, dude, like push the ball down the field. Like if you're holding on to the ball a little bit anyway, push the ball down the field. But again, it's hard to really I don't know how you could even remotely be comfortable in that system. The offensive infrastructure was just so bad. The system is garbage and the offensive line is untenable. So I just don't know like how much he trusted his ability to like play the way I think he really wants to play. So I don't know. He's a really interesting case study. You mentioned like the character stuff. I've actually heard like nothing but like really good things about his work ethic. And to
Yeah.
me, so you mentioned like the part about like maybe his personality not being for everybody. I think that's a great way to put it. I think that that's probably true. At the end of the day, though, it really just comes down to one thing, like, can you ball? If you can ball, none of that other stuff matters, man. And like it will be really evident early on in his career if he's got it or if he doesn't. So that's the thing in terms of like how's the locker room gonna take to the guy? Like how's he gonna be as the face of a franchise? We'll get that answer really quickly, but at the end of the day, it really only matters like can he play? If he can play, all that other stuff, like his personality and stuff, doesn't matter in my opinion. So at least not nearly as much as like the oxygen that I feel like has taken place over that
Ex-
sort of topic. But
exactly. And I think JT O'Sullivan actually put this really well.
hmm
When we talk about capital A anticipation versus like lowercase anticipation, I think there's a lot of lowercase anticipation with a lot
yeah,
of like how he plays. And for me, when I'm betting on a like weaker armed passer, I typically want it to be like in the higher end of that. And
for
that's why
sure.
I struggle with Shador, a little bit more than most. And I definitely think there are legitimate concerns in his game, but I also think a lot of the legitimate concerns are getting glossed over for stuff that does not matter in the
Right.
grand scheme of things.
And that's the really frustrating part. I feel like just of the cycle, and like what gets talked about, like what matters, what doesn't. You mentioned like like we both talked kind of about some of the concerns about the arm, like the lower body. Like he's going to have to become like more of like a rotational thrower. Like
Agreed.
he's gonna have to figure out a way to kind of tweak some stuff with that. And he's gonna have to throw a better anticipation. Like not saying like I don't think he's Joe Burrow, but I'm just saying like Joe Burrow coming out, like one of the things that was a concern with him was like he doesn't have the greatest arm. Like, is he a guy that really is a true like number one pick, especially in a class that involves Justin Herbert? The thing about Burrow, every comeback route, everything, and it's even translated now, like later in his career over the middle of the field too. But balls outside the numbers after his rookie season when he came back from that injury, everything is out 2 steps before the break. I mean, he never misses. He's never late to the sideline. That's why he doesn't throw a lot of interceptions because the ball is literally on a receiver's face mask the second that he turns around. That's how Shedeur is going to have to play if he's going to be able to access outside the numbers. But the stuff inside the numbers, again, it does need to go from like small anticipation to like capital A type stuff. But
Yeah,
I'm assuming we both got the same number one. I mean, Cam Ward, we've been talking about him for a long time. I mean, he's been a known commodity. Like you mentioned, the experience thing with Shedeur. I mean, Cam's been a starter. He's been worked his way up from Incarnate Ward to Washington State to Miami. I was really excited about the fact that he went back to school this past season because like he had pretty much, if I remember correctly, I saw that the league had him graded out as like a third, fourth round prospect last year, and I I think he obviously made an incredible decision for himself going back to school, making himself better. But Ward, the things that really pop up on tape for me is just the poise that he plays with. This dude never looks like he's frazzled in the pocket. Just has a really cool, calm, and collected demeanor about him. Bullets are flying in his face. He doesn't care. Like he'll stand in there, take shots, throw down the field. I think the arm is not quite elite, but it is very good, especially when you factor in like the lightning quick release. This dude is an absolute machine in the RPO and the quick game world. I mean, he can absolutely dice people up just because he can get the ball out so freaking quickly.
The
I
arm angles
actually,
around defenders too with
and
that.
I actually think that his stuff in the quick game shows that the promise is there with his lower body, which I do think is a concern a little bit right now. The footwork is an absolute mess a lot of the time outside of the quick game, but you watch him go with these 1-step or 3-step drops from the gun for these quick game concepts. You talk about anticipation. There are some balls that get out and on receivers in a hurry to the point where like they're not even expecting them, and NFL receivers are going to be able to catch those. And like he really had a good understanding of how to do those things. I do think there are enough anticipatory throws over the middle of the field. He's a little bit shorter of a player, but he does throw in between the numbers, which is something that I always want to see. I think it's important to be able to access that area of the field. Already mentioned just like the confidence that he plays with. I just think that there's like a cold bloodedness about his game. I mentioned just like how cool he is. He
The
just
cow game with with the 12th man on the field where he points at him.
But you know what? Everybody's tweeting that play, which I think
Yeah,
it's a fantastic play. It really is. And the play that Nick's referring to that's like circulating Twitter over the past like 24 hours is he's trying. They're going with a little bit of tempo, and there's a player running off the field. He takes the snap and points to the refs at the player that's still on the field, like Rodgers esque, and then takes the drop back and then rips a ball like right down the seam, if I remember correctly.
yep.
But the crazy part about that play, they're down like 38-18, and he leads them all the way back, like for a game, for a touchdown, like at the buzzer. I mean, it's just, I really, and this is going to sound like so cliche, but I think that Cam Ward thinks that he's the best player to ever play college football. And I think that like you need like irrational confidence at the quarterback position. Like I talk about that all the time, like confidence for players, but I just think quarterback and corner, those are just two positions that you have to have that like really strong-willed mentality, and you just have to have this insane belief about your own ability. And I just think that Ward feels like he's the greatest player of all time. And there are moments where it certainly looked like that last year. Like he was absolutely unstoppable from time to time. In terms of like the negatives, I already mentioned the footwork needs to be completely overhauled. Just in terms of the consistency outside of the quick game, it's pretty rough. Like it's almost like, I mean, the amount of like trick shots that are on film are cool in some ways when they work, but the accuracy really suffers a lot of the time. And that's why some of like, if you look at the numbers, the accuracy stuff isn't really, is he really a top pick type of worthy type of player or prospect? Because he's trying to do a lot of trick shots, throwing off platform unnecessarily when he doesn't actually have to. He can set his feet, step into the throw, and be more accurate in that regard. But the arm talent is very, very good. And there's a lot of upside with him. I do have a first round grade. Some of the other stuff that I think could be cleaned up, which we haven't really talked about with some of these guys, because it's just not something that I value super heavily in my process, just because I feel like guys, when they get to the league, can clean this up pretty quickly. Decision making is an issue with him. Like, I just think that there are some of the most inexplicable interceptions that you'll ever see this side of Kyle McCord. There's a play against Duke where it's like the second half and he's like rolling out to his right. I think it's like in the third quarter, and he like inexplicably throws over the middle, overthrows a player and like easily intercepted. Like one of the worst interceptions that I saw all season long. So there is some of that where it's like, hey man, like we don't have to score every play. You know, we can just take what the defense gives us. I think eventually he'll just grow out of that. A lot of quarterbacks have. But it is worth noting right now that I think the decision-making element of it, like I said, sometimes he just thinks he's the greatest player ever, and it can get him in a little bit of trouble.
Yeah, you mentioned they didn't, that decision making. I honestly feel that he was kind of justified given how bad Miami's defense was all year. They were
Track shoots every week. Yeah, track
it was just
shootouts.
it was just a track meet every single time, and
Yeah.
I'm not comparing this directly. I would never do that. but like it reminded me a little bit of watching like Mahomes back at Texas Tech, because like
Same.
he just felt the urgency. He had to score like almost every play, so he was constantly like pressing. And
Hmm.
sometimes he would make these ridiculous trick shot throws, and sometimes he would make an interception that was just inexplicable for no for no reason whatsoever. But one aspect I really love about Cam Ward, you mentioned the footwork. It's a bit unconventional, but something I really appreciate about him is being able to throw from offset platforms, because he uses his footwork in a way where like he's using his body, his stance to manipulate defenders out of windows. Like you'll see it a
Hmm.
lot with his high-low game. He is great at just baiting guys with his by pointing his shoulder to where what to like the outside flat, and then he'll like turn his shoulders and then square himself directly to the guy who's like inside. And I just love seeing manipulation traits like that, because I think those are like the big time traits you want to see in a quarterback.
Oh yeah.
Now, the decision making, it could definitely be better. I think I'm more concerned about the accuracy sprays from time to time. I think, like you said, just needs to set himself better. And I think, as we saw with Bo Nix a little bit, there are going to be times where you're ironing out your footwork, but you're not going to always be able to be, on platform, and you're going to be kind of like, you're going to be off platform even when you don't want to. And I think, Ward can definitely fix that, but it might take a little bit more time. I
Yeah.
definitely think it's something he can work on. Now, something I love about his game, he does all of his audibles, his pre-snap stuff. He does the protections. That's something I really wanted to see going into this season, and I'd like the fact that Miami was just able to trust him with that much knowledge despite being a transfer. And I think his experience, like you said, 5 years of starting, but he's like he's not like 25. He's actually
Yep.
like he's more of like around 22, 23. I didn't fact check this beforehand, but the fact he's like one of the more younger quarterbacks and he's got all that experience is such a huge boon in his evaluation. And I think you look at the body of work, the level of throws he can make. That's the thing that I need to constantly get across. It's not just the fact that he has great arm strength, he has great arm talent. He knows how to feather the ball into those windows. He has such
Hmm.
a gifted ability to be able to access that velocity while also being able to put it into those like tight, situations along the sideline. Like he has some incredible hole shots. Now they're gonna be, and this is another thing I actually was pretty impressed with Ward. When he hits his back, sometimes he will just end his drop early, and he'll just
Yep.
get the ball out. And that's something like the footwork is not tied to the concept. So I think the fact that he has that freedom and the fact he can just see it and be confident enough to rip it in those situations, I really respect that about Cam Ward's game. I think Ward is definitely a first round talent in this class. I think he is comparable to some of the quarterbacks like Bo Nix in last year's draft class. I think he's got maybe maybe a bit higher of a ceiling in that regard, with a
Hmm.
bit lower of a floor, but similar type of guys. I think he is a good prospect. I don't necessarily know if I'd want to be, eager to take him at like number one overall, like the Tennessee Titans might be
Yeah.
doing. But I do think he is a guy that you take in the top 10 of most, quarterback drafts. I think he is a guy that you can bet on. I think he has the character traits. I think there's a lot of stuff to like on film, and some of the stuff that is weaknesses with him are fixable. And that's what I
Yeah.
really like about him.
Yeah, I mean, like that's kind of like what really sold me too on like giving him a first round grade. I don't necessarily have like a tier one type of grade on him, like where he's like where I kind of feel like he's a top like 10 type of guy, like not in the. I mean, I think Caleb Williams and Drake May kind of are at the top of like that kind of spectrum, like we saw last year, but still a first round player in my
Yeah.
opinion, and someone that you take if you need a quarterback. But that was kind of the thing that sold it for me is like I do feel like a lot of the issues with his game are correctable. Now, some of them are more easily fixable than others. One thing I do like to point out with Ward is I came into the season thinking that sacks were a problem because like he's a playmaker and he's got great feel for making things happen out of structure. And like we saw definitely a lot of highlight real throws last year, but he also reduced the amount of negative plays. 7 interceptions. There were some turnover worthy plays. Maybe he was a little bit fortunate in some regard in that aspect, but he took his pressure to sack ratio from 24.9 down to 15.9. 15.9 is actually like really good for a college quarterback, especially in that environment. Because I mean, the offensive line wasn't perfect in Miami, and I think the receivers honestly were a little bit underwhelming as well. I actually don't think they helped him out as much as I kind of anticipated, or I thought they did when watching live. I went back to watch the tape and was kind of underwhelmed by some of their guys on the perimeter. So I think that Ward, to me, the footwork stuff is going to be the biggest challenge. And that's somewhat what I talked about with the decision making. Josh Allen's a guy who came into the NFL. I thought his footwork was an absolute mess. He had to completely overhaul his entire kind of setup. I've seen Ward do it. It's just not consistent enough. That's why I kind of like really wanted the Giants to kind of trade up, just because Dabo worked with Allen in that regard. I just feel like that would be a perfect landing spot for him. I don't know what Callahan's going to want in a quarterback. It does seem like Tennessee may be leaning towards it, but I can understand the vision behind, taking a guy like Cam Ward. So, yeah, that was a lot of thoughts on the quarterback class. I really appreciate it. It was good. It was good breaking all these guys down, especially in a quarterback class like this, where I feel like there does need to be a lot of like nuanced conversation and in-depth detail put into it. So I do appreciate all the continued support for the channel, for the podcast. Make sure you go follow Nick on social media, get all his thoughts. We will be back next week, and we'll talk to you guys soon. Peace and love.